It's strange how a single decision can ripple through your life, turning an ordinary day into the kind of memory that claws at the back of your mind. For me, that decision came the morning I ignored the warning signs. The docks were alive with their usual chaos. Men shouting over engines, the tang of diesel fuel, the screeching of seagulls circling for scraps. The Sea Whisperer, my battered old trawler, was loaded and ready for another long day. My routine was the same as always: check the nets, secure the gear, ignore the gossip. Except that morning, the gossip wasn't just idle chatter. "Something's off this week," old Ken muttered, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. His knotted fingers seemed to tremble with the effort. "There's a weird feeling in the air." I glanced up from tying off a line. "Weird like what?" Ken squinted at me, his weathered face as lined as the nets we used. "Can't say for sure. Just bad luck waiting to happen." I chuckled, trying to hide my unease. Fishermen were always talking about luck, but I never bought into it. I figured you made your own fate out there. But something in Ken's tone made me pause. By the time I left the harbor, the sky was clear, the breeze steady. Perfect conditions for a good haul. I shook off the old man's words as dockside paranoia. About an hour into my run, I spotted it. A buoy. It wasn't unusual to see markers in these waters, but this one didn't sit right. It wasn't on my charts, and its paint was peeling, faded to an almost grayish hue. But it wasn't just the appearance that gave me pause. It was the way it seemed to float slightly off-kilter, like it didn't belong there. I should have kept going, just motored right past and forgotten about it. Instead, I killed the engine and drifted closer. Curiosity isn't just a vice. Sometimes it's a death sentence. As I leaned over the side, I saw strange markings etched into the metal. They weren't words, at least not any language I'd ever seen. They looked more like carvings, jagged symbols that felt deliberate, purposeful. My first thought was vandals. Maybe some bored sailor thought it'd be funny to deface a buoy. But as I reached out with a hook pole, a chill ran down my spine. Not the kind you get from cold air, but the kind that creeps up when you know you're being watched. I paused, glancing around. The water was empty. No boats, no birds, no sign of life. And then I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration at the edge of hearing. "Leave it." The words crawled under my skin. I spun around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but I was alone. The Sea Whisperer swayed gently beneath my feet, its creaks the only sound. I wanted to move on. Every instinct told me to leave the thing alone. But curiosity is stubborn, and I wanted answers. I snagged the buoy's chain with the hook pole, planning to pull it closer for a better look. That's when everything changed. The moment the pole touched the chain, the air grew heavier. Not just humid, it felt oppressive, like the weight of the sky pressing down. My chest tightened, and my pulse quickened. And then I felt it. Not a sound this time, but movement. Subtle at first, like a faint vibration underfoot. It grew stronger, a rhythmic thudding that echoed through the boat. I yanked the pole back, heart hammering, but the feeling didn't stop. Then came the crash. The boat jolted violently, throwing me against the controls. I tasted blood, bit my lip on impact. The Sea Whisperer tilted sharply to one side, the deck slick beneath my boots. My first thought was a snag, a rock, maybe, but when I looked down, the chain was gone. The buoy had vanished. I scrambled to the controls, firing up the engine, but the air around me felt thick and heavy, like breathing through gauze. My skin prickled as a low, guttural voice filled the space around me. "You are marked." I froze, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The voice wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere. And then it stopped. The engine roared to life, snapping me out of my paralysis. I steered toward the horizon, desperate to put distance between me and that spot. But no matter how far I went, the feeling lingered. A cold, gnawing dread that refused to fade. By the time I reached the shore, I knew something was wrong. My left hand felt different. I pulled off my glove and stared. The skin was blackened and rough, like it had been burned. Strange marks ran along my palm, curling and twisting into symbols I didn't recognize. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew one thing for certain. The sea wasn't finished with me. The first real sign of trouble came when I spotted the damage. After escaping the eerie stillness around that strange buoy, I'd brought the Sea Whisperer back to the docks, thinking I'd put the whole thing behind me. But as I stood on the pier, staring at my boat, I noticed deep gouges in the hull. At first, I thought it must have been the rocks near the shore, but that didn't make sense. The damage was too clean, too deliberate. 3 parallel slashes ran along the side of the boat, each one precise, as though carved by massive claws. My stomach tightened. I reached out, fingers brushing the rough edges of the wood. The damage wasn't just superficial. The grooves had splintered deep into the frame. I'd need repairs, serious repairs, before I could take her back out. But even as I stood there, trying to calculate the cost in my head, a sound drifted up from the water. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low, guttural rumble, like the growl of some enormous animal. I froze, my hand still pressed against the damaged hull. The sound came again, a deep vibration that seemed to ripple through the water itself. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd hear from a fish or even a whale. This was different, primal, alien. And it was close. My pulse quickened as I leaned over the edge of the dock, peering into the dark water below. At first, all I could see was the murky green, flecked with bits of seaweed and debris. But then something moved, a shadow, enormous and slow, passing just beneath the surface. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing into the depths. But the water still churned, as though something massive had disturbed it. "Jesus," I muttered, taking another step back. The docks were quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear the chatter of fishermen or the hum of boats coming and going. But now, nothing. Just the soft slap of water against the pier and the distant cry of a gull. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Before I could dwell on it, a voice called out from behind me. "Rough night." I turned to see old Ken standing a few yards away, his gnarled hands resting on the handle of a battered crab pot. His sharp eyes scanned me, then the boat. "What happened here?" he asked, nodding toward the slashes in the hull. "Don't know." I lied, my voice unsteady. "Might have hit something on the way in." Ken frowned, his gaze lingering on the damage. "Those don't look like no rocks to me." I didn't respond, and after a moment, he let out a low whistle. "You didn't touch anything strange out there, did you?" The question caught me off guard. My mind flashed to the buoy, to the strange markings and the way it sank beneath the waves. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Ken shrugged, but his expression was grim. "Just that the ocean's got its own rules. You don't mess with what you don't understand." His words hung in the air long after he shuffled away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the shadow beneath the water. I sat in my cabin, nursing a beer and staring at the growing cracks in the wooden table. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, made my skin crawl. When I finally crawled into bed, sleep didn't come easy. And when it did, it was restless, filled with images of black, writhing shapes and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. I woke just before dawn to the sound of splintering wood. The noise jolted me upright, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was a dream, but then it came again, a loud, wet crack, followed by the groan of something heavy shifting. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and hurried to the window. At first, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The docks were quiet, bathed in the dim blue-gray light of early morning. But as I scanned the area, my beam landed on the Sea Whisperer, and my blood ran cold. The boat was sinking. Water poured through a gaping hole in the hull. The wood around it twisted and splintered as though it had been punched clean through. But that wasn't the worst part. Something was moving near the boat. A massive shape, half submerged, its skin slick and dark, bristling with jagged fins. I caught a glimpse of a long, coiled tail, thick as a tree trunk, thrashing in the shallow water. And then I saw its head. It rose slowly, water streaming off its angular, armored face. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow-green that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Rows of jagged teeth glinted as it opened its massive jaws, letting out a sound that was half roar, half gurgling hiss. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the floor. By the time I looked again, The creature was gone, the water still rippling where it had been. But the damage was done. The sea whisperer groaned as it sank lower into the water, the mast tipping precariously. I knew I couldn't save her, not without help. And even if I could, one thought consumed me. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me yet. The next few days passed in a haze. After the sea whisperer went down, I spent most of my time on the docks, avoiding questions from the other fishermen. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns, and every conversation seemed to stop when I walked into earshot. They'd glance at me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease, but no one said much. Even old Ken kept his distance. He watched me from under the brim of his cap, chewing on his pipe like he was working up the courage to speak. But whatever he wanted to say, he never got around to it. Couldn't blame them. I didn't have answers to the questions I knew they were thinking. Questions I was asking myself every time I closed my eyes. What was that thing I saw? And why did it feel like it wasn't finished with me? I tried to stay busy, helping out around the docks or tinkering with gear, but the silence in my head was unbearable. Every creak of the pier, every splash of water, felt like it was meant for me, some unspoken signal just out of reach. It wasn't until the third night that I decided I needed to do something, anything, to make sense of what had happened. The idea came as I was sitting in my small apartment above the bait shop, staring out the window at the harbor. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the water. It was a calm night, the kind that should have been comforting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced at the small table by the door, where I'd dumped the few salvageable pieces of equipment I'd managed to pull from the Whisperer before she sank. My old handheld depth finder caught my eye, its scratched surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. An idea began to form. The thought of going back out there, to the spot where everything started, sent a chill down my spine. But I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them sitting in the dark, jumping at shadows. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I borrowed a small skiff from the docks, an old but reliable rowboat that creaked with every push of the oars. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed to get back to the area where I'd seen the buoy. I told myself I'd just take a look, drop the depth finder, maybe cast a line or two to see if anything felt off. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. The water was eerily calm as I rowed out, the soft splash of the oars the only sound for miles. The horizon stretched out endlessly, the sky an empty expanse of gray. When I reached the spot, I stopped rowing and let the skiff drift. The air felt heavy, the same way it had the day I'd found the buoy. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. I reached for the depth finder, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned it on. The screen flickered to life, casting a faint blue glow over the boat. I dropped the sensor into the water and waited, watching the numbers scroll by. First, everything seemed normal. The readings were consistent, the depth hovering around what I expected for this part of the coast. But then the numbers started to climb. 50 feet, 70, 90. The depth shot up faster than it should have, the display blinking erratically. I frowned, tapping the screen, and then it stopped. The finder froze at a depth that didn't make sense. Over 200 feet, far deeper than it should have been for these waters. And as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it, the air around me changed. It was subtle at first, just a faint shift in the breeze. But then the surface of the water began to ripple, slow and deliberate, as though something massive was moving beneath it. I leaned over the side of the boat, heart hammering in my chest. The water was dark and murky, impossible to see through. Then something brushed the bottom of the skiff. The impact was soft, almost gentle, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the boat. The ripples grew stronger, spreading outward in concentric circles, and the depth finder began to beep erratically. I didn't wait to see what came next. Grabbing the oars, I rowed as fast as I could, the small boat lurching with every stroke. The ripples followed, growing larger and more chaotic, until the water was churning violently around me. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a shape, enormous and dark, cutting through the water just beneath the surface. But I didn't stop to look. By the time I reached the safety of the harbor, my arms were burning, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. I collapsed onto the dock, gasping for air, the skiff bumping against the pier behind me. As I looked back at the open water, the waves had already calmed, the surface smooth and unbroken. But I knew what I'd felt, what I'd seen. Something was down there, and it wasn't going to let me leave it alone. I sat on the dock for what felt like hours, staring out at the calm sea. The ripples, the shape beneath the water, the brush against the skiff. All of it played on a loop in my mind, a rising tide of dread I couldn't shake. Whatever I had disturbed wasn't natural, and whatever it was, it had noticed me. I needed answers. The problem was, the kind of answers I needed weren't the kind you'd find in a book or from a marine biologist. I didn't even know where to start. But as I sat there, clutching the splintered wood of the dock, a memory surfaced. Old Ken. He'd been acting strange ever since the day my boat came back damaged. He'd been watching me, keeping his distance, but I'd caught him muttering to himself more than once. Words I couldn't quite make out. If anyone on the docks knew something, it was Ken. He'd been fishing these waters longer than I'd been alive, and his knowledge of the coast was practically legendary. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. I found him where he always was, perched on an overturned crate near the bait shack, puffing on his pipe and staring out at the horizon. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but his sharp eyes tracked me as I approached. "Ken," I started, my voice uneven. "I need to talk to you." He didn't say anything, just took a long drag from his pipe and let the smoke curl out of his mouth. I hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Most of the other fishermen were busy prepping their boats or unloading the day's catch, their chatter a low hum in the background. "It's about the buoy," I said finally, "and what I saw out there." Ken's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten ever so slightly. He tapped the bowl of his pipe against the crate, knocking out the ashes, and stood. "Come with me," he said. I followed him into the bait shack, the door creaking shut behind us. The air inside was thick with the smell of salt and fish, and the dim light cast long shadows across the cluttered space. Ken leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You touched it, didn't you?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. "That buoy wasn't just some marker, boy. It was a warning." "A warning for what?" I demanded, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "What's out there, Ken? What did I see?" For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. His eyes flicked to the window, as if he were expecting something, or someone, to be watching. "There are things in the sea," he said slowly, his voice low and deliberate. "Things older than you or me, older than this town. They don't come up often, but when they do, they're best left alone." My mind raced. "So what was it? Some kind of animal?" Ken's laugh was bitter. "Animal?
No, lad.
Animals don't leave marks like the ones on your hand." I froze. Ken noticed the shift in my expression and nodded. "I thought so. That's how it starts. The marks are a sign. You've been noticed." "Noticed by what?" I pressed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded scrap of paper. When he handed it to me, his hands were trembling. I unfolded the paper, revealing a crude drawing. It was old, the edges yellowed and worn, but the image was clear enough. A monstrous shape rising from the water, its body a tangle of fins and tentacles. The eyes were what stood out the most: large, glowing, and impossibly menacing. This can't be real," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Ken snorted. "Real enough to sink ships and swallow men whole." I stared at the drawing, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "What is it?" "They call it the Deep One," Ken said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been around longer than anyone can remember. Sailors used to tell stories about it, how it had come for anyone who trespassed too close to its domain. Most folks don't believe in it anymore, but that doesn't mean it's gone." His words hung heavy in the air, the kind of weight you can't just brush off. "So what do I do?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. "How do I get rid of this thing?" Ken shook his head. "You don't. The sea doesn't forgive, lad. All you can do is stay out of its way and hope it forgets you." That wasn't good enough. I couldn't just sit back and wait for this thing to come for me. "There has to be a way," I insisted. "Some way to stop it." Ken hesitated, his gaze darting to the door. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. There's a place, an old wreck about 5 miles off the coast. They say it's where the Deep One sleeps. If you're mad enough to go there, you might find your answers. Or you might not come back at all. The wreck. My stomach twisted at the thought, but I couldn't ignore it. If I wanted to put an end to this, I had to take the risk. As I turned to leave, Ken grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, boy," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "If you go out there, you need to understand something. The Deep One isn't just a creature. It's the sea itself. And once it's set its sights on you, there's no going back." I nodded, my throat tight, and stepped out into the daylight. The harbor felt different now, the usual bustle muted under the weight of what I'd just learned. As I prepared the skiff for another trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Deep One was already watching, waiting. The wreck was out there, somewhere beneath the waves, and I was going to find it. The next morning, I set out before dawn. The wreck, Ken had said, was 5 miles off the coast, a place whispered about but never marked on any chart. A graveyard of steel and wood, swallowed by the depths long before I was born. I wasn't sure what I expected to find out there. Answers, maybe, or, at the very least, an end to the constant dread that had followed me since I'd touched that buoy. The skiff felt small and fragile against the vast, open sea. The horizon stretched endlessly, painted in shades of gray as the sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds. I kept my eyes on the water, scanning for any sign of movement beneath the surface. The trip should have taken an hour. Felt like a lifetime. The first sign of the wreck was a jagged shadow rising from the water, black and sharp against the waves. As I drew closer, I saw rusted beams twisted like broken bones, half submerged in the ocean. The wreck was enormous. Its hull split open as if something had torn it apart from the inside. The air was different here, thicker, colder. Even the waves seemed slower, more deliberate, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. I dropped anchor a safe distance away, the chain rattling against the side of the skiff. My heart pounded as I stood at the edge, staring down at the wreck's skeletal remains. I could see the outline of its shattered decks beneath the surface, draped in seaweed and barnacles. Something about it felt wrong. I pulled out the depth finder, the screen flickering to life. The readings were erratic, the numbers jumping wildly between shallow and deep. Whatever lay beneath the wreck, it wasn't natural. Then the water began to ripple. At first, it was subtle, just a faint disturbance near the wreck. But it grew quickly, spreading outward in concentric circles, the waves lapping against the sides of the skiff. My hands tightened around the edge of the boat as I leaned over, trying to see what was causing it. And then I saw it, a shape, massive and dark, lurking just beneath the surface. It moved slowly, deliberately, its outline shifting like smoke in the water. My breath caught in my throat. The thing beneath the waves was impossibly large, its shadow stretching far beyond the wreck. I couldn't make out its full form, but I caught glimpses. A flash of jagged fins, the curve of a scaled body, and eyes. Eyes that glowed faintly, like embers in the deep. It was watching me. The boat rocked violently as the thing beneath the water moved, sending waves crashing against the hull. I stumbled back, gripping the edge for support. My depth finder beeped frantically, the screen flickering as the readings spiraled out of control. The creature rose, its shadow growing darker, closer. I should have left. I should have pulled the anchor and rowed back to shore as fast as I could. But something kept me rooted in place, my eyes fixed on the water. And then it surfaced. The head broke the surface first, dripping with seawater and glistening in the dim light. Its skin was slick and black, covered in jagged ridges that pulsed faintly as it moved. Rows of sharp teeth glinted beneath a massive jaw, and its glowing eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The creature let out a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the air, a noise that wasn't quite a growl but carried a terrible weight. It wasn't just watching me. It was waiting. For what? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever I'd disturbed, whatever I'd brought on myself, wasn't going to let me leave so easily. The monster didn't attack. It hovered there, its massive, ridged head barely breaking the surface, watching me. Those faintly glowing eyes seemed to pierce right through me, like it wasn't just looking at me. It was reading me, pulling apart every thought, every memory. I froze, gripping the edge of the boat so hard my knuckles ached. My mind screamed at me to move, to pull the anchor and row for my life, but my body wouldn't listen. Then the monster sank back beneath the surface. The water stilled almost immediately, as if the thing had never been there at all. The only evidence it had existed was the deep, dark ripple that circled out from where it had vanished, spreading slowly toward the horizon. My hands were shaking as I hauled the anchor back onto the skiff, the metal chain rattling like a death knell. I rowed away from the wreck as fast as I could, the little boat lurching with every frantic stroke. But even as the shoreline came into view, I couldn't shake the feeling that the monster hadn't gone far. When I finally reached the dock, I didn't go straight home. Couldn't. My thoughts were a tangled mess, questions spinning out of control. Why hadn't it attacked me? Why had it just watched? And why did I feel like I'd seen those eyes before? I made my way to the bait shack, where Ken was sitting on his usual crate. He glanced up as I approached, his sharp gaze flicking to the skiff, then back to me. "You went to the wreck," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "I saw it, Ken. The monster. The deep one." Ken's face darkened. He pulled out his pipe and lit it, the tiny flame casting flickering shadows across his weathered features. "What did it do?" he asked after a long silence. "Nothing," I said, my voice trembling. "It just stared at me." Ken didn't respond right away. He puffed on his pipe, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Finally, he said, "If it didn't kill you, there's a reason. The sea doesn't do anything by accident." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What reason?" I demanded. "Why me? What's my connection to all this?" Ken sighed, tapping ash from his pipe. "You sure you want to dig into this, boy? Some questions ain't meant to be answered." But I couldn't let it go. The image of those glowing eyes was burned into my mind, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. I started digging. The next few days were a blur of research and half-sleepless nights. I combed through old records at the harbor office, scanned faded newspaper clippings, and talked to anyone who'd listen. Most people brushed me off, muttering about superstitions and stories, but a few, mostly the older fishermen, offered cryptic fragments of information. The wreck, it seemed, wasn't just a ship. It had a name. The Sovereign, an old freighter that had sunk nearly 80 years ago under mysterious circumstances. The official story was that it had hit a reef during a storm, but the records didn't add up. The weather that night had been calm, and no reef had ever been found near the site. What's more, several crew members had vanished before the ship went down. No bodies were ever recovered, and their disappearances were never explained. But the most disturbing detail came from a brittle old journal I found tucked away in the harbor's archives. It belonged to one of the sailors aboard the Sovereign, a man named Elias Coombs. His final entry read, "It watches from the deep, its eyes a beacon in the dark. The others think it's just an old tale, but I've seen it. I've heard it in the water, felt its pull, and now it's calling to me. I don't think I'll be coming back." The date of the entry was the day before the Sovereign sank. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Elias's words felt too familiar. The way he described the eyes, the pull, I'd felt it too. That night, I had another dream. I was back on the Sea Whisperer, the deck swaying beneath my feet. The sky was black, starless, and the water around me was deathly still. Then, slowly, the monster rose from the deep, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. But this time, it wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the water around it, smaller shapes that writhed and twisted in the darkness. They were human, or at least they had been once. Their features were bloated and distorted, their limbs elongated and unnatural. They reached for me, their mouths opening in silent screams. I woke gasping for air, my chest tight and my skin clammy with sweat. The connection was clear now, though I didn't want to believe it. The markings on my hand, the feeling of being watched, the pull toward the wreck. It was all tied to the Sovereign. And if I wanted answers, I'd have to go back. If I was going back to the wreck, I wasn't going unprepared. The monster wasn't just lurking in the deep. It had history, power, and if Ken was right, intent. Whatever had happened to the Sovereign, whatever strange force had dragged it under, wasn't finished yet. And if I was connected to it, I needed every advantage I could get. The first step was finding someone who'd believe me. Ken was reluctant, of course. He'd spent decades trying to keep his distance from the wreck, warning others to do the same. But after days of pestering and showing him the journal I'd found, he finally gave in. "You're stubborn boy," he muttered, lighting his pipe for the 5th time that morning. "Either stubborn or just plain stupid." "Probably both," I admitted. Ken agreed to help on one condition: we'd do things his way. That meant no cutting corners. We spent the next 2 days scrounging supplies from every dusty corner of the bait shack. Old diving gear, battered harpoons, ropes, and flashlights. It was a patchwork of tools, none of them designed for what we were up against. The harpoons were the worst. Ken swore they'd been used back in his whaling days, the tips still sharp but rusted from decades of neglect. They were heavy, unwieldy, and smelled faintly of fish guts. "What do you expect me to do with these?" I asked, holding one up. "Hope you don't have to use them," Ken replied. He was more serious about the diving gear. The oxygen tanks were ancient but still functional after some maintenance, and the suits, though stiff and reeking of mildew, were reinforced enough to offer some protection. "Won't stop teeth that big," Ken said as we tested the seals. "But it'll slow 'em down." The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source: the lighthouse keeper. Old Maggie was a legend in her own right, a reclusive woman who'd lived on the rocky outcrop overlooking the harbor for as long as anyone could remember. Most people avoided her, something about her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, but Ken swore she knew things about the sea that no one else did. We found her in the lantern room, polishing the massive Fresnel lens with practiced precision. "You've got guts, coming here," she said without looking at me. "Or you're an idiot." "Probably both," Ken muttered. Maggie turned, her piercing blue eyes narrowing as she studied me. "So you're the one who woke it up." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice weak. She snorted. "Doesn't matter what you meant. It's awake now, and it's not going to rest until it gets what it wants." "And what's that?" I asked, bracing myself for the answer. She shrugged. "Could be anything. A life, a memory, a soul. The sea doesn't care what you think is fair." I felt my stomach twist, but Maggie wasn't finished. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, weathered talisman. It was made of bone, etched with intricate symbols that reminded me of the markings on my hand. "This'll keep you breathing a little longer," she said, pressing it into my palm. "But don't get cocky. It won't save you if you're stupid." Ken and I left the lighthouse in silence, the wind howling as we made our way back to the docks. By the time we finished loading the skiff, the sun was setting, casting the horizon in shades of blood red and gold. "This is it, then?" I said, my voice barely audible over the lapping waves. Ken nodded, his expression grim. "If you've got any second thoughts, now's the time to speak up." I didn't. The fear was still there, coiled tight in my chest, but so was something else: determination. "I'm ready," I said, gripping the talisman Maggie had given me. Ken didn't say anything. He just started the engine, the old motor sputtering to life as we headed out toward the wreck. The journey was eerily quiet, the sea unnervingly still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the skiff cut through the water. When we reached the site of the wreck, the first thing I noticed was how much darker the water seemed. It wasn't just the setting sun. It was something deeper, an unnatural blackness that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Ken killed the engine, and the silence was deafening. "Last chance to back out," he said, though I could tell he didn't expect me to. I shook my head, pulling on the diving gear with trembling hands. As I adjusted the oxygen tank, Ken placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't do anything stupid down there," he said. "And for God's sake, don't let it touch you." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could promise either of those things. With one last deep breath, I lowered myself into the water, the talisman clutched tightly in my gloved hand. The cold hit me like a shock, seeping through the suit and into my bones. I kicked my legs, letting the weight of the gear pull me down into the darkness. The wreck loomed below, its jagged edges covered in seaweed and barnacles. As I descended, the oppressive feeling I'd experienced before grew stronger, pressing down on me like a physical force. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, growing brighter with every passing second. The monster was waiting, The wreck was even larger than I'd imagined. As I descended through the murky water, the jagged skeleton of the Sovereign came into view, a rusted labyrinth of beams and broken decks, its once proud hull now twisted and gaping. Seaweed draped the wreck like rotting flesh, and strange, pale fish darted through the shadows. But it wasn't the size of the wreck that made my chest tighten. It was the silence. The ocean is never truly quiet. There's always a hum of life, the distant clicks of dolphins or the soft rustle of currents. But here, around the wreck, there was nothing. The water felt thick, suffocating, as though the wreck itself had swallowed all sound. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the skeletal remains of the ship's upper deck. The railing was bent inward, as if something massive had forced its way through. I kicked my legs, moving closer to the twisted metal. My breath echoed loudly in my ears, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen tank the only sound in the crushing silence. As I floated above the deck, something caught my eye, a faint shimmer on the corroded metal. I angled the flashlight downward, revealing strange carvings etched into the ship's surface. The symbols were identical to the ones burned into my hand. My heart pounded as I traced the patterns with the beam of light. They weren't random. There was a purpose to their arrangement, a strange, alien logic that I couldn't begin to understand. I reached out, my gloved hand hovering over the symbols. A voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to pull back, but curiosity got the better of me. The second my fingers brushed the metal, a jolt shot through my body. Images flooded my mind in rapid succession. Flashes of the Sovereign's crew, their faces twisted in fear and agony. I saw sailors scrambling across the deck, shouting orders as the ship listed violently to one side. Something enormous loomed in the water below, its glowing eyes piercing through the chaos. And then the ship split. The Sovereign didn't sink from a storm or a collision. It was torn apart, dragged into the depths by the very thing that had been watching me. The vision ended as suddenly as it began, leaving me gasping for air. My fingers jerked away from the metal, and the carvings pulsed faintly, as if mocking me. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The water felt colder now, and the oppressive weight in my chest grew stronger. That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered across the deck, some half buried in the sand that had settled over the wreck. They didn't look like they'd been picked clean by scavengers. These bones were cracked and splintered, as if something had crushed them, and they weren't all human. Among the ribs and skulls were fragments of something else. Longer, thicker bones, curved and ridged in ways that didn't make sense. I moved closer, shining the flashlight on a jagged piece of what looked like a jawbone. It was lined with teeth, sharp, serrated, and far too large to belong to anything I'd ever seen. I forced myself to look away, my stomach churning. As I turned to leave, the beam of my flashlight caught something else. Movement. At first, I thought it was just another fish, but as I focused the light, I realized it wasn't. A shadow darted between the broken beams of the lower deck, quick and deliberate. My pulse quickened as I swam closer, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But something about the shadow felt familiar, almost human. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The shadow wasn't swimming, it was walking. I froze, hovering in the water as the figure stepped into the light. It was a man, or at least it had been. His body was bloated and pale, his limbs elongated and unnatural. Seaweed clung to his tattered clothes, and his eyes were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to devour the light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure turned toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, its head tilted, as if it were studying me. Then, without warning, it lunged. I kicked backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp. My flashlight slipped from my hand, tumbling into the darkness below. The thing moved faster than I thought possible, its long arms reaching for me with clawed fingers. I fumbled for the harpoon strapped to my side, ripping it free just as the creature closed the distance. With a panicked shout, I thrust the weapon forward. The harpoon struck its chest, driving the creature back. A dark, inky substance seeped from the wound, swirling in the water like smoke. But it didn't stop. The thing let out a low, gurgling sound, its mouth opening wide to reveal jagged, broken teeth. It grabbed the harpoon, snapping it in half with terrifying ease. I kicked away, my lungs burning as I struggled to swim upward. The creature didn't follow. It hovered there, watching me with those hollow eyes as I ascended toward the surface. When I finally broke through the water, gasping for air, Ken was already leaning over the edge of the skiff, his face pale. "What happened?" he shouted. I didn't answer, couldn't. All I could do was stare at the water below, knowing that whatever was down there wasn't finished with me yet. The water was unnaturally calm as Ken and I waited in the skiff, the wreck looming below us. The heavy tension in the air was like the silence before a storm, the kind that made your gut tighten and your instincts scream to run. But there was nowhere to run. Ken adjusted the harpoon in his hands, the metal tip rusted but sharp enough to pierce flesh. "Stay calm," he muttered. "Don't panic. Whatever happens, keep your head." I nodded, though my hands trembled as I gripped my own harpoon. The wood of the skiff creaked underfoot, and I flinched at every sound. The first sign came as a ripple in the water, a subtle disturbance that grew steadily stronger, spreading outward from the wreck. Ken tensed beside me, his sharp eyes scanning the surface. "Here it comes," he said, his voice tight. At first, I thought the shadow rising beneath us was part of the wreck, a loose section of the hull dislodged from the seabed. But then it moved, slow and deliberate, its outline rippling through the water like smoke. When the head broke the surface, my breath caught. It wasn't a monster in the storybook sense. It had no glowing eyes, no towering form dripping with malice. But its size and presence were enough to freeze me in place. The massive, dark shape was hard to define, its mottled skin blending seamlessly with the water. Its ridged back glistened faintly in the moonlight, and its gaping mouth revealed rows of jagged teeth that looked more like tools of survival than weapons. The creature circled us, its movements deliberate, testing us. Every time it passed beneath the skiff, the boat rocked, the water churning in its wake. "Don't let it tip us," Ken barked, gripping the edge of the boat to steady it. The creature suddenly lunged, its massive body slamming into the side of the skiff. The impact sent me sprawling, my harpoon slipping from my grasp and clattering against the wet wood. "Grab it!" Ken shouted, his own harpoon at the ready. I scrambled to retrieve the weapon, my fingers slipping on the slick surface. Before I could steady myself, the creature struck again, its head breaching the surface with a spray of water. Ken moved first, driving his harpoon toward its side. The tip struck home, sinking into the thick, rubbery flesh just below the ridged back. The creature recoiled, thrashing violently, and the skiff tilted dangerously close to capsizing. "Get the other one ready," Ken yelled, his voice barely audible over the chaos. I fumbled with the second harpoon, my hands trembling as I adjusted my grip. The creature circled again, its movements more erratic now, as if it was weighing its options. Then it came straight for us. I braced myself, the harpoon angled toward the approaching mass. The boat rocked violently as the creature slammed into it head-on, its rough skin scraping against the hull. This time I didn't miss. The harpoon struck deep, and the creature let out a low, guttural groan that vibrated through the water. It thrashed again, and I was thrown backward, my back slamming into the edge of the skiff. "Get the line!" Ken shouted, pointing to the coil of rope at my feet. I grabbed the rope and threw it to him, my breath coming in short gasps. Ken looped it through the harpoon embedded in the creature's side and tied it off to a rusted cleat on the deck. The creature surged, dragging the skiff several feet before the line went taut. The entire boat groaned under the strain, the cleat creaking as the rope held fast. But the creature wasn't finished. It thrashed harder, the water churning with foam as it tried to free itself. The boat tipped dangerously, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we were going under. Ken grabbed my arm, his eyes wild. "If we don't finish it now, we're dead." I nodded, reaching for the last harpoon. My hands were steady now, the fear replaced by a grim determination. As the creature turned for another lunge, I waited for my moment. Its ridged back broke the surface, exposing the vulnerable area where Ken had already struck. I thrust the harpoon with everything I had. The tip sank deep into its side, and the creature let out a sound that was more a shudder than a roar. It convulsed, its body twisting violently, and for a moment, I thought the skiff would be torn apart. But then it stopped. The water stilled, the creature's massive body sinking back beneath the surface. The rope pulled taut for a final, heart-stopping second before going slack. We sat there in silence, the skiff rocking gently in the aftermath. My chest heaved as I clutched the side of the boat, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Ken leaned back, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. "We're not out of this yet," he said. "We need to get to shore before it comes back." I didn't argue. With trembling hands, I started the motor, the small engine sputtering to life. As we made our way back to the harbor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't won. Not really. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting, and I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. We made it back to the docks just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The air was cold and damp, the mist rolling in from the sea clinging to every surface. Ken and I barely spoke as we tied the battered skiff to the pier, our movements slow and deliberate. The harbor was quiet, the usual bustle of fishermen noticeably absent. Felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. Ken sat heavily on an old crate, his hands shaking as he lit his pipe. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, said enough. I crouched beside the skiff, staring at the frayed rope that still hung limply from the cleat. The memory of the creature's thrashing body, its ridged back and unblinking eyes, was burned into my mind. For a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over, but the quiet didn't last. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of salt and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the tang of blood. The water in the harbor, once calm, began to ripple again. Ken stiffened, his pipe slipping from his lips and clattering to the ground. He didn't move to pick it up. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's not gone," he said. "Not by a damn sight." I followed his gaze, squinting at the distant line where the ocean met the sky. The surface looked calm, but I could feel it. A faint, rhythmic vibration beneath the dock, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. The sea was restless. I stood, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me like a physical force. My hands ached, my body felt hollow, but my mind refused to let go of the question that had haunted me since this nightmare began. "Why me?" I asked aloud, more to myself than to Ken. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse. "The sea doesn't pick people at random," he said. "It sees something in you, something it wants." I turned to him, my throat dry. "And what if I don't want to give it?" Ken gave a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and empty. "You think it cares what you want?" We sat there in silence, the distant cry of gulls the only sound. I tried to tell myself that I'd survived, that the worst was behind me. But deep down, I knew better. The markings on my hand hadn't faded. If anything, they'd grown darker, the strange, curling patterns pulsing faintly under my skin. Whatever connection I had to the wreck, to the creature, it wasn't finished. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the uneasy ripples in the harbor began to fade, the water settling back into an unnatural calm. But the feeling in my chest remained, a heavy, gnawing weight that I couldn't ignore. Ken stood, dusting off his hands. "You should leave town," he said. "Go somewhere far from the sea. Maybe it'll forget about you." I shook my head. "You don't believe that?" "No," he admitted. "I don't." We parted ways without another word. Ken shuffled back toward the bait shack, his shoulders hunched against the cold wind, while I lingered on the dock, staring out at the open water. The sea stretched endlessly before me, its surface glittering in the morning light. To anyone else, it might have looked peaceful, even beautiful. But I knew better. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves, the creature was waiting, watching, and it wouldn't stay hidden forever. That night, as I lay awake in my small apartment, I thought I heard something. A faint, low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. I sat up, my heart pounding, and walked to the window. The harbor was dark, the water still, but the air felt heavy, the way it had before the creature first surfaced. I didn't sleep, and when dawn came, I knew one thing for certain. The sea wasn't finished with me,